When thinking about human knowledge, there are two essential categories. One is the category of factuality, and the other is the category of interpretation. Factuality is the status of being a fact. It is common to define a fact as a state of affairs in which an object possesses a property. For example, an apple may be red. That state of affairs, which is the redness of the apple, is a fact that can be expressed by the proposition the apple is red. Interpretation, on the other hand, can be defined as the act of identifying an object as something. For example, when you see a chair and identify it as a chair, as opposed to a mountain, you are interpreting your experience. To be more technical about it, interpretation is the application of individuative concepts to an object of experience. In any instance of knowledge, fact and interpretation of fact come together. To know that there is a green car outside, the state of affairs expressed by that proposition must actually be instantiated, and I must be able to identify that object as a car. Now we could ask the question, which of these categories, factuality or interpretation, is more fundamental? In other words, is factuality ultimately logically prior to interpretation, or is interpretation ultimately logically prior to factuality? Atheism's answer to this metaphysical question seems to be the former. See, atheism takes for granted the non-createdness of the facts. On atheism, the only agents capable of interpretation are humans, and human minds are not metaphysically ultimate or fundamental by any means. My interpretation of a fact is not what makes the fact what it is. The human mind has no control over factuality. The facts are there, existing independently of our minds, and we come along and try to interpret them. So the atheist, if he isn't some kind of solipsist, must affirm the priority of factuality over interpretation. The problem, however, is that if the category of factuality is ultimately more fundamental than the category of interpretation, then knowledge becomes impossible. Interpretation requires an interpretative schema which possesses the necessary individuative concepts. Without individuative concepts like flower, book, chair, etc., I wouldn't be able to identify an object as something. My experience would just be of a blank, undifferentiated identity. Furthermore, interpretative schemas introduce relations between individual facts. If an object was so individual in character that it shared nothing in common with any other object, then it would be impossible to identify it as something. It is the roundness, the sweetness, the redness of an apple, qualities it has in common with other objects, that allows me to identify it as an apple. The conclusion then is that apart from an interpretative schema, facts are unrelated to one another. Now, to know a fact, my interpretation of that fact must correspond to actual state of affairs. What this entails is that the facts must conform to my interpretative schema. But this cannot happen since my interpretative schema has no influence on the facts. Because factuality precedes interpretation, the facts are what they are independent of any interpretative schema. And if this is the case, then the facts are wholly individual and cannot correspond to any interpretative schema. Hence, if factuality precedes interpretation, the human interpretation of a fact can never correspond to the facts themselves, and thus knowledge of a fact becomes impossible. And since atheism entails the priority of factuality over interpretation, it entails that human knowledge is impossible. But human knowledge is possible. I know that there is a computer in front of me, that I have two hands, and that the earth revolves around the sun. And if I know these things, atheism must be false. If Christian theism is true, then there is no problem because ultimately interpretation is more fundamental than factuality. This is because God interprets all facts, identifying and individuating them, even before they are instantiated in time. It is God's interpretation of a fact that makes the fact what it is. Hence, the facts conform to God's interpretative schema. And as long as the human interpretative schema mirrors God's interpretative schema, human interpretation will correspond to actual states of affairs.